Michael Wayne Donaghy was born on May 12, 1986 in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. When the boy was just 4 years old, he accompanied his family to Blanchard Elementary School so they could watch his mother participate in a practice session of flag football. They were a close-knit, loving family who showed plenty of support for each other's passions and hobbies, and Michael's father would often bring the whole family to cheer along their mother during competitive games. The family arrived at the elementary school at around 12:30 p.m. on the Sunday of the 24th of March 1991, about a half hour before the flag football practice was due to commence. Michael's mother, Crystal, walked him over towards the main sports field, while his father, Bruce, stayed behind at the family's car to collect a few belongings, including a hamper of sandwiches and snacks that they would consume while watching the practice. But on the way, young Michael spied an adventure playground, complete with a swing set, seesaw, and climbing frame. Desperate to spend a little time careening around the play area, Michael begged his mother to allow him a little playtime before they would take a seat in the stands. Crystal was never one to deny her young son a little fun when he'd been behaving himself, so she permitted him to do so, but made him promise to let his father collect him as soon as he arrived to do so. However, when Bruce was told where Michael was and walked over to fetch him, he found that Michael was nowhere to be seen. Bruce walked around the play area, calling his son's name while checking under the slides and anywhere else Michael might be hiding, but still he couldn't find him. Panic ensued. Bruce ran towards the crowd that had gathered at the edge of the sports field, informing them that his son was missing. Around 50 people began scouring the area, looking for the missing toddler, while Bruce and Crystal rushed to use a nearby payphone to inform the police that their boy was missing. Since Michael disappeared from a public place in such an apparently short period of time, it was judged to be a case of child abduction, and the investigation that followed became one of the largest in Canadian law enforcement history. Every single detective from the Victoria Police Department was called in to assist in the search, as the boy's disappearance from a public playground struck fear into the hearts of parents up and down the country. As a result, and compounded by the high levels of publicity that the case received, thousands upon thousands of tips came in from all over North America, which at the time made for extremely time-consuming work, since everything had to be written down on actual paper and filed manually. The lack of digital technology hampered the investigation, and many have since suggested that technology such as CCTV cameras, DNA analysis, and computerization may have actually contributed in solving the case. The initial bulk of the investigation involved Victoria police officers interviewing known child predators and questioning their whereabouts at the time of Michael's disappearance. Police also talked to everyone who had been at the flag football practice, but unfortunately the only piece of pertinent information involved just a handful of people having seen a man in his late 40s or early 50s was hanging around a large brown van which was parked near the playground in which Michael had been playing. Yet despite the eyewitness statements, police were unable to secure the license plate number of the van, and nor were they able to get a detailed description of the man with the brown van. The situation got so desperate that a month after Michael had disappeared, local police staged a detailed recreation of the supposed abduction at the very same site it had occurred. Using a brown van and an officer who posed as the apparent abductor, police hoped that the recreation would jog the memories of those that had seen anything, either at the playground or in the surrounding area. The general public was told that on that day that he vanished, that Michael was wearing a blue hooded jacket with red lining and red cuffs, a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles t-shirt, multicolored rugby pants, and blue sneakers. Yet despite their efforts, the recreation failed to produce a single new lead in the case, and over the months that followed, time and resources were exhausted to the point that the investigation was basically abandoned. Michael's parents were heartbroken. Since it was entirely possible that Michael Donaghy was smuggled into the United States after his abduction, many news outlets south of the border asked Americans to rack their brains to recall if they had seen any child fitting Michael's description, who seemed to be accompanied by a sketchy or skittish man. As a result, There were reported sightings of the boy in South New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. In fact, the last reported sighting of Michael Donahue came on the 19th of June, 1991, when there was an attempt to abduct a 7-year-old girl from the street outside her home in Berlin Borough, New Jersey. The targeted girl screamed so loud that it brought people out of their homes, who subsequently chased away the potential abductor and prevented the girl from being taken. In the aftermath, eyewitnesses stated that not only was there a large brown van present during the failed abduction, but there was a small Caucasian boy in the passenger seat who had blonde hair and blue eyes. The physical description was an exact match to that of young Michael. Aside from the idea that Michael was abducted, there have been several other interesting theories regarding the reasons for his disappearance, the first being that Michael simply wandered off. Blanchard Elementary School is just a short walk away from the Christmas Hill Nature Sanctuary, which is home to the rather large Swan Lake. It is entirely possible that Michael simply tottered off into the park, fell into the lake, and drowned, before being carried downstream and out into Victoria Bay before his body could be found. It has also been suggested that Michael was taken by a so-called black market adoption ring. He was young enough to be indoctrinated into believing he was entirely a different person, and given that there were many black market adoptions in the 1980s and 1990s, this theory cannot be entirely dismissed. The phenomenon persisted well into the 21st century, too. In 2014, Guernica magazine reported on a case of a Guatemalan couple that claimed their daughter, who had been adopted by a family in the state of Missouri, had been kidnapped by a myriad of people working in the child trafficking business. In that particular instance, it was deemed that both the child's and the biological mother's DNA reports were falsified and processing documents were forged so that the adoption appeared legal. The article revealed a sinister side of international adoption, consisting of government involvement and even trafficking for the purpose of organ harvesting. But another, albeit outlandish, theory has been purported that Michael had fallen victim to a satanic cult. In the years that followed his disappearance, some sections of the amateur detective community suggested that it was no coincidence that Michael was abducted on Palm Sunday, 7 days before Easter, and 7 streets away from Easter Street in Victoria. These theorists claimed that Victoria, British Columbia, was the satanic worship capital of the world, and that Michael was taken as an offering to Satan. These claims stemmed from the 1980 publication of a book called Michelle Remembers, which details the assertions of one Michelle Proby, who recalled several months of evil, violent satanic rituals she was subjected to as a child in her hometown of Victoria. She claimed that her memories of the events had been repressed for decades until a psychiatrist by the name of Lawrence Pasder unlocked them using hypnotherapy. It was while under hypnosis that Proby started to recount a horrifying web of torture, murder, and, most relevant of all, abduction. She said she remembered being from her family, then groomed to participate in a ritual. The goal was to summon Satan himself. The ritual apparently included children being locked in cages with snakes, forced cannibalism, and the eventual blood sacrifice of said children. The book was an explosive bestseller and became a kind of template for scores of other claims of satanic ritual abuse and what became known to many as the Satanic Panic. On the surface, the claims made in the book seemed far too far-fetched to actually be taken seriously, yet Proby was no crank. She seemed to be perfectly calm and rational, holding down an otherwise unremarkable family life in suburban Victoria. Dr. Pastor was also not an obvious fantasist. He was a family man and respected professional psychologist who had no history of outlandish theories or research. Perhaps we'll never know if there is any truth to such claims, and if there is, they may provide something of a fascinating yet horrifying insight into just how and why Michael disappeared from Blanchard Elementary School on that warm summer morning in 1991. As of 2016, Michael Wayne Dunhee's case remains open, and all evidence is available to the public. There are also a handful of retired Victoria police officers who claimed they were continuing their investigations outside of a professional capacity. For them, it's no longer a professional endeavor, but a personal quest to see justice served. Even in the face of such dire odds, all involved are hopeful that someday more information will come to the fore that shed more light on what has been a case that's as baffling as it is tragic, and that the many unanswered questions that have plagued Michael's parents and police officers alike will finally be answered. When I was a kid, my family moved from our home in upstate New York all the way down to North Carolina, all because of something to do with my dad's job. It was a pretty scary time in my life. For someone so young, you have to leave behind their school friends and stuff and settle in an entirely new place. It was deeply disconcerting and saddening. But none of that compared to what I'd face one day during elementary school. To me, it was a morning a lot like any other. Nothing remarkable or ominous about it. I mean, the weather seemed pretty terrible, so there was no outside recess during the morning, but that's not entirely unusual during fall on the East Coast. But as the afternoon progressed, I remembered looking out the windows of our classroom and seeing the light drizzle of the morning progress steadily into some of the heaviest wind and rain I'd ever seen. Like it was pounding against the windows so hard at one point that our teacher had to actually raise their voice in order to make themselves heard. Not long after, another teacher walks into the classroom, quickly walks up to our teacher standing at the front of the class, and whispers something in her ear. Our teacher immediately goes all wide-eyed, and although we didn't know exactly what had been said or what was going on, the super tense feeling just descended over the class, like we instinctively knew something was wrong. Class continued for a little while. All the while the weather outside continued to get worse, only this time, instead of just ignoring it, our teacher kept looking out of the windows. I remember turning to see what she was looking at and seeing like a bunch of stuff flying across the playing field outside. Nothing major, just a lot of paper and bits of plastic, but I'd never seen anything like that before, and it made me really, really nervous. Then, the intercom in our classroom buzzed into life, saying something about how all teaching staff and pupils needed to take shelter in the hallways immediately. So we did, and with our teacher trying to keep us all calm, and she struggled to keep a lid on her own fears, we filed out into the hallway and were told to sit down on the floor out there. By that point, we could all hear the sounds of the wind howling outside of the building, even through some pretty thick cladding and stuff, which was terrifying all on its own. And the louder it got, the more and more afraid we all got as our teachers explained that it was just some nasty weather and it couldn't hurt us so long as we were in the hallways. Things were fine for a little while, but our classroom was right next to the library, and at one point, just as the mood seemed to be as tense as it could get, we all heard this big crashing sound coming from behind the closed double doors. It was so loud and frightening that all the kids immediately screamed when we heard it, and it was followed by these horribly loud howling wind noises that seemed to echo down the hallways we were sat in. It honestly sounded like a big old monster had just come smashing its way through the glass and was tearing around the library, knocking things over as it went. Some of the other kids were inconsolable at that point, as the screams turned into sobs and wails that the teachers tried and failed to calm. It was like a rolling choir of fear and misery, with almost every second kid just either quietly sobbing or openly wailing. I admit to crying myself, but it was only upon hearing another kid saying to a teacher, "I want to go home, and I want my mom and dad, I need mom and dad," that just made me think of my own parents, and how this horrible and bizarre event might be affecting them too. That's when I couldn't find it in me to be brave anymore, and I broke down crying as well. We ended up staying in that corridor for hours, way past the time we all should have been filing out of the school for the end of the day. It was actually dark out by the time the howling noises stopped coming from the library, and you can't even imagine the sense of relief that came over us when we were told that our parents would be coming to collect us from school in the next hour or so. I cried again when I saw them near the main entrance, running up and giving them a huge hug. I was just so thankful that they were safe and that whatever was going on outside hadn't gotten them, as I was so terrified that it might. As it turns out, the school had been hit by a tornado. It definitely wasn't the worst kind that could have hit, but as I mentioned, it was bad enough to blow out the windows in the library, or maybe it was a tree that was felled that somehow managed to smash through the windows. I didn't actually see what exactly caused the damage. But at that age, I wasn't even sure what a tornado even was. Like, sure, I'd heard the word before, but I'd never been caught in anything as crazy as that, and neither had most of the other kids by the way they reacted. It was without a doubt the single most pant-wettingly scary thing that ever happened to me during my entire childhood, let alone during my time in elementary school. Since then, I've had a profound respect for how awesomely powerful the forces of nature can be, and how they are not to be taken lightly. I know this isn't as gripping or terrifying a story as some of the school lockdown ones I read about from time to time, but for all of us in school that day, it was like a nightmare come to life. Beatrice Angelica Mota was born on the 11th of February 2008, the second daughter of Sandro and Lucia Mota. She grew up on her family's farm not far from the city of Petrolina in northeastern Brazil, in an area known for producing a huge amount of tropical fruit, such as guavas, papayas, and mangoes. Despite the region having a reputation for violent crime, the countryside outside of Petrolina is considered more peaceful, and for Beatrice's parents, it was a place they could raise a family in relative tranquility. Along with her older sister, Beatrice was enrolled at a private Catholic elementary school situated in downtown Petrolina. It was one of the most esteemed educational institutions in the entire state of Bahia, a place that might not have been able to afford to attend if their father Sandro hadn't been employed as a teacher there. Naturally, the school came to play a huge role in Mota's family's life, but unfortunately, not always for the best reasons. On the evening of the 10th of December 2015, when Beatrice was just 7 years old, the entire Mota family attended a graduation ceremony that was being held at their school. Almost 1,000 proud parents were gathered to celebrate an important chapter in their children's lives, and the event featured live music and speeches from both teachers and parents alike. Since Sandra Mota was an employee and was helping run the ceremony from behind the scenes, Beatrice was being looked over by her mother, Lucia. However, sometime around 10 p.m., while the graduation ceremony was still in full swing, Beatrice told her mother that she wanted to get a drink at a water fountain close by. Lucia told her daughter to come straight back to her, but when about 10 minutes went by and Beatrice had not returned, Lucia got up to go look for her. She was concerned but didn't panic, as the school grounds were fenced off by patrolling security guards. She could have only gone so far. But around 45 minutes later, despite the aid of a handful of the school's security team, Beatrice had still not been found. By that point, Sandro Mota had been notified that his daughter was missing and took to the bandstand, using the microphone to notify the audience that Beatrice was missing. He even used the PA system to call out to her personally, saying, "Beatrice, my daughter, where are you? Hey, Bea, everyone is looking for you, my love." The parents and teacher alike started to search the school grounds for the 7-year-old, calling out her name until eventually a blood-curdling scream could be heard, coming from the entrance of the school's gymnasium. The scream was unleashed by one of the school's security guards, who had made a horrifying discovery in one of the gym's closets. It was the bloody, lifeless body of Beatrice Mota. Police rushed to the scene as news of the girl's death reverberated around the crowds of parents and children. A handful of families would remain behind at the school to console Beatrice's devastated parents, but after being questioned by police, the rest were ordered to leave so that a thorough investigation could commence. They were soon joined by high-ranking members of the state police, as well as forensic examiners who immediately began scouring the crime scene for leftover fingerprints and DNA. For some, It was the most haunting crime scene they had ever come across, having never seen a child who had been so violently and brutally murdered. An autopsy of her body later confirmed that she had received a total of 42 stab wounds to her chest, stomach, arms, and legs, which suggested whoever had killed her had done so in a frenzy of violent rage. But who exactly could bring themselves to do such a thing to an innocent 7-year-old child? Initial speculation was that whoever had committed the crime had a personal motive, given the ferocious nature of the attack. The wooden handler butcher's knife that had been used to take her life was actually found buried in her abdomen, which suggested that the killer had been in such a rush to escape the scene that they hadn't even bothered to hide the murder weapon. Police also noted that there was no evidence that Beatrice had been indecently assaulted, which was a relief to all involved, but further confused investigators who were completely stumped as to why this crime had been committed. The sheer number of potential suspects also proved a huge problem for investigating police. Not only was there around 1,000 people present at the graduation event itself, but given that the school was in downtown Petrolina and any number of people could have snuck onto the grounds of the school to commit a crime of opportunity that involved dragging her into an isolated spot to inflict the horrific attack. As a result, police began a long and drawn-out process of gathering up CCTV footage from the cameras of the school, as well as neighboring homes, businesses, and the personal video cameras of parents in attendance. However, they were also furious to discover that the security cameras that covered the entrance to the gymnasium were not functional. This was down to an accidental fire that had been started near the gymnasium's entrance, but police speculated that since this was the one place where the cameras weren't working, that whoever murdered Beatrice may have well been aware of this and had carefully chosen that spot to drag her off to. Despite the vast amount of footage that investigators managed to secure, they were completely unable to trace the movements of Beatrice after around 10:09 p.m., when she got up to get some water from the fountain. Footage captures her walking off from her mother, but after that, there was nothing, which is presumably the time she was snatched up and dragged off to her doom. Police concluded that whoever killed her had to have an intimate knowledge of the school's layout, having chosen the one place in the entire school that wasn't covered by the vast network of CCTV cameras. The other fact that supported this theory was the killer had also fled the scene without being seen by a single person or being captured on a security camera, and given that he was likely covered in blood, this would not be an easy feat to achieve. They must have known the school grounds very well to either find an unguarded or a gap in security fencing that no one else was aware of. During interviews with hundreds of witnesses, many had spoken of seeing an unfamiliar man hanging around the area of the water fountain. One of the witnesses claimed to have seen him halted while attempting to enter the woman's bathroom before claiming it was an innocent mistake. Another said they had seen the man walking out from the gymnasium shortly before Beatrice's body was found. This would lead to the police to centering their investigation on this individual and releasing a digital composite image of the man after consulting their multiple eyewitnesses. When shown the composite image, Beatrice's father Sandro would tell police that he saw the individual approach 2 children that evening, asking both to help him carry some furniture into the place where Beatrice was found dead. This suggested that she had been a willing follower of the killer, which would explain why no one's attention was drawn by any kind of violent kidnap. It also suggested the murder was purely one of opportunity, as the murderer had simply taken the life of the first child who had accepted his invitation. The composite image showed a Latino man of tan complexion that was relatively short, at around 5.5 feet tall, weighing only 155 pounds, who had deep-set eyes, a prominent brow, and stern-looking features. Witnesses stated he was wearing dark blue trousers and a green-collared shirt, the latter of which would become part of the moniker that the press referred to him as the Green Shirt Man. However, only a few days after the release of the composite sketch, investigators were forced to consider the theory that there had been multiple people involved in Beatrice's murder. This was due to there being not one, but 2 unidentified DNA samples recovered from the crime scene, one of which came from the murder weapon, the other coming from the skin samples taken from underneath Beatrice's fingernails, with both samples thought to have come from unrelated males. Then, shockingly, in March of 2016, police called a press conference at which they announced that as many as 5 people had acted in a team in order to carry out the murder, which may or may not have included people employed at the school. The revelation came from the discovery that 3 sets of keys had disappeared from the school's security offices, allowing the killers access to the school's internal and external doors and gates. The keys have been reported missing in around 2 weeks before the murder, suggesting a nature of premeditation to the crime. Police would also claim that the lights in the gymnasium had been deliberately turned off around the time of Beatrice's murder, and that sections of the CCTV footage from the night in question had been deliberately corrupted. They said that both acts were part of a well-laid-out plan to kidnap and murder a child on the night in question. While investigators would choose not to release the names of ages of their 5 suspects to the press, they did pass on some of their suspicions, one of which was that all except one of their suspects were employees of the elementary school, who had either lied or attempted to mislead the police regarding certain details when they were being interviewed. One of the suspects were described by witnesses as having been extremely nervous around the time of the murder, while 3 claimed they were nowhere near the crime scene, claims that were proven false by the analysis of video evidence. Yet despite the police's suspicions, not a single member of the school's staff ended up being charged with the murder or any relating crime. However, all these men would be fired by the school after learning of their status as suspects, possibly simply as damage control to calm the nerves of distraught parents. In the months that followed, police would release footage to the public of the green-shirted man, who they could now confirm was the murderer. From the footage taken from surrounding businesses, he can be seen walking in the direction of the school with a rather unique lurch or gait in his step. When he reaches the school, he takes out a cell phone, engaging someone in conversation for a moment before hanging up. It is then that he reaches down and retrieves a knife that has been previously hidden in a bush before tucking it into his sock. He then walks onto school grounds, ready to take the life of an innocent child. And aside from a few shots of the green shirt man walking around the school grounds, no other footage of him exists, leaving investigators to only be able to guess at how he escaped the scene of the crime. As the investigation floundered, public interest in the story began to fade, and it wasn't until 3 years later that a break in the case was picked up by the national press, and Beatrice's name was back in the news. An outsourced IT worker who was working in the school named Allison Henrique had been identified as having lied during his police interview. And it was alleged that the corrupted CCTV footage was down to him having deliberately erasing certain files from the school's computer servers less than a month after the murder had taken place. December of 2018 saw an arrest warrant issued for Henrique, who, instead of allowing himself to be questioned, went on the run and became a wanted fugitive. His home was raided by police, but they were unable to find anything incriminating during the search that followed. However, while on the run, Henrique remained in touch with his lawyers, instructing them to release a statement claiming that he was hiding because he knew police simply wanted to make a scapegoat of him to distract from their own failings. On Henrique's behalf, the lawyer went on to say that it was in fact the police themselves that caused the data corruption, that he had no prior criminal history and had his IT business had no history of such glaring errors. Though over time it would become increasingly obvious that Henrique had no involvement in Beatrice's murder, given that he worked off-site and was not present at the time of the graduation ceremony. No concrete blame could be laid at his feet for the corrupted footage, which would eventually be salvaged with the help of the United States FBI. And so in 2019, a Brazilian judge would revoke his arrest warrant and Henrique would go about his life as normal again. To this day, not a single person had been successfully charged with Beatrice's murder. Beatrice's parents, Sandro and Lucia Mota, had been so outraged by the authorities' mishandling of the case that in 2019 they began crowdfunding to start their own private investigation into their daughter's murder. They felt they had been so failed by the Brazilian state that they no longer sought help from them at all, convinced they were unable to provide the answers they needed. Beatriz was buried on a plot on the family farm, where a small shrine was built in her honor, so the extended family could continue to pay their respects whenever they visited. And over time, the raw grief they felt has been replaced with anger that despite all the evidence and investigation, not a single shred of justice has been served. We can only pray that, with time, Beatriz's family can finally find the answers they deserve, and that they, as well as Beatriz, can finally rest in peace. Here in the UK, we don't really have elementary schools, but the equivalents are called junior or primary schools. The school I went to had a tiny playground, I think there were only about 100 kids in the entire school, so the little concrete play area was maybe only 50 meters across, it was tiny. So if something happened on the playground, every kid and supervising teacher could see it, which I suppose suited them down to the ground. But it didn't suit me the day something happened to Lewis, because one day, we're all just legging it around the playground as little kids do, not a care in the world, when I hear one of the teaching assistants scream really, really loudly, "Lewis! Lewis!" I remember it was autumn because I was playing with some fallen leaves when I heard the scream. Don't ask me why. Kids are daft, aren't they? I spin around, like every single other kid in the playground after hearing that blood-curdling screech, to see the teaching assistant kneeling down by Lewis, who was just lying on the concrete, with blood pouring out of his mouth. Not a little drip, a steady stream of blood was just cascading out of the corner of his mouth and pooling on the ground beneath him. That was horrific enough, but the thing that really got to me was that he was totally unconscious, and that his eyes had just rolled up in their sockets, so you could only see the whites of his eyes while he bled uncontrollably from his mouth. Lewis was the only black kid at our school, too, so from looking across the playground, the whites of his eyes just seemed to shine out to me as I looked. I just remember that specific sight. I'd have probably found it just as disturbing if it was one of the white kids, but the color contrast meant that they just stood out even more, and I remember that scaring the life out of me as all the kids just started running for this main school building. Loads of us just piled into the cloakroom. Some kids were crying, others were pale and in shock, and I obviously can't speak for any of the other kids, but I 100% thought that Lewis was dead. I'd never seen any kind of injury like that before, at least when my mate Ewan broke his leg when he fell off a swing set. He'd scream bloody murder until the ambulance came. I knew he was alive, even if it was really distressing, but Lewis was out cold, bleeding like a stuck pig, and good God, his eyes. I didn't know eyes could even do that back when I was that age. Afternoon classes basically got canceled after that, and the kids were just distraught, so no one was in a fit state to be concentrating on lessons. We were just kept in our classrooms until we were all called into the main assembling hall to hear the news about Lewis. We didn't get all the gory details, only that Lewis had taken a fall in the playground and had banged his head. We were told that he'd been taken to the hospital and that he was okay, but he'd be off school for a week or so while he healed up. Lewis was back before we knew it. We were all super relieved to see him. I remember the first day he was back, we all gathered around him as he showed off the big scar inside of his lip where he'd fallen on his face. He'd also had lost a few baby teeth, which I suppose was lucky, as he was about to lose them anyway, I suppose. That was definitely the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen in my childhood, though. I'm 32 now, and it's been 25 or so years since it happened, but I remember the whole thing as clear as day. It just burned in my memory. Those eyes. There's something I'll never, ever forget. On the afternoon of Friday the 16th, May 1986, 43-year-old former town marshal David Young and his wife Doris calmly walked into Cokeville Elementary School in the small town of Cokeville, Wyoming. David headed for the school's office, where many of the teachers immediately recognized him. He was the only police officer for 6 months in the town of just over 500 people. But after being fired for misconduct, he moved to Arizona, where he met his wife, Doris. Needless to say, he was well known among the locals. The teachers regarded him with confusion, and he began to hand out a series of leaflets to them. Upon reading, they found the leaflets were titled 0 = Infinity, and detailed a series of bizarre ramblings and demands. Some of the teachers looked up from the leaflets, asking David Young just what was going on. His reply was simple: "This is revolution." As he did so, Doris Young was going from classroom to classroom with a pistol in her hand. When she arrived at each, she instructed both teachers and children to follow her, grouping 136 children, 6 faculty, 9 teachers, and 3 other adults into a single classroom. Once they were successfully corralled and held hostage, David Young then walked into the classroom with a large gasoline-based incendiary device. The device had been built in a small shopping cart and consisted of 1-gallon milk jug of gasoline, wired with a single blasting cap. Thrown into the cart were bags of black powder, along with boxes of bullets and links of steel chain which were supposed to act as shrapnel during the detonation. The detonation mechanism consisted of what is known as a dead man switch, which was tied to David's wrist. 2 metal connectors were soldered to the jaws of a clothing leg, with a small piece of wood in between them, forming an incomplete circuit. Once the wooden was removed, the mechanism would have to be held open by hand, so that if the user was shot by a police sniper, the mechanism would close and the device would detonate. David then demanded to be allowed to use a phone, with which he would contact the police to make several demands. The Cokeville hostage crisis had begun. Both David's reasons for taking hostages, as well as his demands, are frankly insane. Despite having connections with several white supremacist groups, including the Posse Comitatus and the Aryan Nations, there seemed to be no racist motivations in his plan. Nor did what he was doing seem to stem from a desire for revenge, even though he had been fired as town marshal 7 years earlier. Rather, as his manifesto stated, David had noted Cokesville's above-average school performance, and with references to the Aldous Huxley's novel A Brave New World, David Young stated that he wished to reign over a community of intelligent children who he planned to indoctrinate with his ridiculous ideologies. David also demanded a ransom of $720 million, $2 million per hostage, and an audience with President Reagan, who he had also sent a copy of his 0 = Infinity manifesto. In a phone call to local police, David told them clearly that any attempt to besiege the school or apprehend him and his wife would end with the detonation of the incendiary device. After hearing David ranting and raving to police officers via telephone, many of the child hostages began to get upset. Some began to cry, wailing hysterically as they understood the dangerous implications of the unfolding events, which some complained of headaches as fumes from the gasoline-based incendiary device filled the air. Doris Young tried all that she could to calm the terrified children, at one point telling them to think of this as an adventure movie, or that when it was over, they would each have a great story to tell their grandchildren. She also gave permission for teachers to bring in books, art supplies, and a television to help keep the children occupied and under control, and even joined in with singing happy birthday to one of the children when they mentioned that it was their birthday that day. However, throughout the hostage crisis, David Young became more and more tense and cantankerous. This may have resulted from the fact that many of the children just sat around and stared at him, something that no doubt made him extremely nervous. Teachers feared that he might snap at any moment, and the crowded classroom was only making the situation worse. They then decided to create an 8 by 8 foot square area using masking tape stuck to the floor, an area that only David was permitted to occupy. Teachers then told the children that this was the magic square, and they were to make a game out of avoiding entering it. As this was happening, police were gathering around the elementary school, careful to keep out of sight from the windows of the classroom in which the hostages were being held. They had also cordoned off and searched a van parked up outside, which they believe had belonged to the hostage-takers. Inside, they made an interesting discovery. Handcuffed in the back of the van were two men, Gerald Depp and Doyle Mendenhall. They claimed to be old friends of David Young and had given him money after he had promised them massive returns on their investments with a plan he called the Biggie. When it turned out that the plan involved hostage-taking, they had refused their continued participation, so on the day in question, David and Doris had taken them hostage too, in order to ensure that they would not go to the police. As they were freed, both men confessed to being utterly terrified, asserting that David Young was a dangerously insane human being who would not hesitate to take the lives of others in his unhinged quest to start off a bizarre kind of cultural revolution. After around 2.5 hours of waiting for his demands to be met, David Young found that he desperately needed the bathroom. First, he transferred the dead man's switch to Doris's wrist, then left the room to use a small bathroom that ran between the first and second grade classrooms. But as Doris stood near the gasoline-based device, she quickly developed a headache from the heavy fumes that emanated from the shopping cart it was contained in. They had no idea at the time, but a tiny hole in the gallon milk jug was allowing fumes to slowly escape, enough to have Doris raising a hand to her forehead to try to ease the discomfort. This action somehow caused the little piece of wood, the one in the dead man's switch preventing the device from detonating, to slip from between the two pieces of connecting metal. The switch was activated, and the device exploded. The door was immediately filled with black flame and smoke, with Doris being horribly burned in the subsequent explosion. In the aftermath of the explosion, teachers began to shove the gathered children into the hallways outside the classroom, and through open windows that led to a grassy lawn outside. The explosion also caused a panic among the children's parents, who had congregated around the police cordon of the school. Some tried to break through the lines and had to be held back by attending officers. David Young heard the explosion from the bathroom and rushed into the classroom, only to be greeted by the conflagration of smoke and flame. He saw his wife burning alive as she rolled on the floor, screaming in agony. He took out a .45 pistol, walked over to her, and put her out of her misery. He then fired a few shots out one of the classroom windows, striking a music teacher named John Miller, who thankfully was only wounded by the shot. David then looked toward the body that was his dead wife's burning body, put the .45 to his head, and pulled the trigger. They were the only two casualties of the hostage crisis, and there would have been far more if it hadn't have been for the open windows of the classroom and some loose ceiling tiles which channeled the force of the explosion and saved the lives of hundreds of innocent young children. As fire crews rushed to put out the burning school building, injured children and teachers were rushed to nearby hospitals. A total of 79 of the hostages had suffered injuries ranging from second-degree burns to smoke inhalation, and local medical facilities were so overwhelmed that some of the injured were even taken over state lines to hospitals in neighboring Idaho. The whole day's events were severely traumatic for all involved, but police began to receive some bizarre and chilling reports when interviewing the children who were present in the classroom that day. Several of the children claimed to have witnessed a beautiful lady present in the room, wearing all white, who told them to go near to the windows in the moments before the explosion. Others told police they had seen an angel floating over each of the children's heads. This could have been down to the prayers that were said by teachers throughout the day having stuck in the memories of children present, while some have suggested that the gasoline fumes may have caused them to see hallucinations. Either way, The angelic assertions of the children were profoundly haunting to the police officers that collected statements from them, and they gave rise to the nickname of the Cokeville Miracle, coupled with the fact that none of the children were killed despite such a large, fiery explosion. A miracle is perhaps the most fitting word to describe what had happened that day. A violent and dangerously insane psychopath engineered a way to kill hundreds of innocent children that day, and somehow, thanks to a series of seemingly random coincidences, not a single child, teacher, or faculty member lost their life when the device designed to kill them was accidentally detonated, even in such a confined space. Maybe some of you believe the accounts of the children that were indeed guardian angels present that day. Maybe you don't. But we can all agree that every single innocent person of Cokeville Elementary was extremely lucky to be able to escape such a terrifying and traumatic event. My kid goes to Cooper Elementary here in Vacaville, California. In early October of last year, I drove them off to school, arriving as usual at around 8 a.m., giving them a kiss, told them I hoped they had a good day, and off they went to morning class. Nothing out of the ordinary, just like any other day. Only right as I'm about to drive off, I noticed something that immediately got my attention, and not in a good way. There's still a woman stood outside, and she's not coming or going or anything. She's just standing there. She looked middle-aged, maybe of Latina or Asian extraction, and she's just sort of watching all the kids come and go. Now, the morning rush is usually just that. Parents pull up, drop their kids off, then leave as quickly as they arrive to get their jobs or whatever, but there's this woman, super chill, just stood there. Then she gets her phone out and starts pointing it around like she's taking pictures or a video of the whole scene. I got this bad feeling in my gut. Like she didn't look like as you'd imagine some old creeper to look. She wasn't wearing a trench coat with a ball cap pulled down over her face. She looked kind of motherly, actually, and if she hadn't just been stood there or recording with her phone, I think I'd have completely passed by her. So instead of driving off to make it to work on time, I just kind of sat in the car watching her. Better safe than sorry, I told myself at the time. And boy, am I glad I stuck around, because things were about to get weird. As I'm sat in my car watching her, I notice that suddenly she seems to take a sharp interest in something. She puts her phone away and seems to be staring over towards the other side of the school parking lot. I try to spy whatever's gotten her attention, but the place is so busy with the morning rush that nothing really stood out to me. So again, I just sit there, waiting patiently as she starts to walk across the street and over towards this parked car. I have to turn around in my seat to see what she's doing, but I'm able to watch clear as day as she walks towards one of the cars and opens the back door before reaching in and pulling out this preschool-aged kid who was sitting in the back seat. She doesn't pull hard or anything, just kind of takes the kid by the hand and leads them out of the car, leaning down to say something to them before she started trying to walk off with them. My spidey senses are tingling by this point, so I jump out of my car, locking the doors before I start power walking over to her. I'm all like, Excuse me, lady, is that your kid? Where are you taking that child?" She turned around all calm, smiles at me, then tells me she's a teacher at the school. I mean, it was actually believable for a moment. She had this lanyard around her neck with what looked like an ID on it. Her answer was so confident, too, and actually called the kid by the name Brian, so for a second, I felt like I was going crazy and that I had gotten way inside my own head about it, playing at being some vigilante or something. I'm all like, oh, sorry. And she accepts my apology, then goes to walk away from the school again. I don't think I'd done anything else about it until I heard another voice behind me shout, "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" I turn around and see this furious-looking dude running towards me and the woman. He runs past me, stops the woman and grabs the kid's arm, pulling him away from her. She then starts giving this guy the same speech she told me, telling him she's a teacher and she's taking Brian somewhere, how he's a student of hers. What this dude said next made my stomach drop. Brian? Brian? My kid's name is not Brian, lady. I'm calling the cops. The guy shouts, and in doing so, draws the attention of everyone coming and going in the parking lot. Once he realized he'd gotten something of an audience, he starts kind of going off like, "This psycho is trying to kidnap my kid. Someone get the cops out here." The mood in the parking lot shifts. Every single parent is basically watching their worst fears played out before them, an unsuspecting person trying to abduct a kid in broad daylight. It was honestly sickening. Firstly, the whole act of trying to snatch the kid, and then the kind of mood shift as all of these half-awake parents just turn into what was basically a violent mob. But the middle-aged lady was quick. She moved faster than I'd ever have expected to out of the parking lot, back across the street, where she jumped into a car and sped off. Parents are taking pictures of her license plate, screaming about child abusers, seriously wanting to rip her apart there and then. I stuck around to talk to the cops, gave a detailed description along with the dad of the potential kidnap victim, whose kid was just distraught by that point. There was a PTA meeting called about the incident. It was this whole big drama that rocked the small community we lived in. And now, just in case none of you believe me, I actually screenshotted a bunch of stuff that was in the LA Times a few days ago. The woman's name was Aileen Carringall. She was 56 at the time of the incident, and she ended up getting followed and arrested by the cops at her home in the 700 block of Christine Drive. The story was sent around to the parents of all the kids attending Cooper Elementary in like a matter of hours, and the relief was palpable. I don't think people who don't have kids can really understand just how terrifying something like this is. Like we're all told there are monsters in the world, but knowing they walk among us, looking just like sweet middle-aged women, when they are in fact complete predators, is just chilling beyond belief. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and all listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to keep your peepees palpable.